Well, welcome, Dr. Ghose, to the SCE interview.
Can I interrupt you there?
Yeah.
Please, no doctor, because that makes me a fraud.
Uh-huh.
I'm not a doctor.
You're not a doctor.
I never got a degree.
Oh, no.
I'm here because I'm here.
Well,
it's a Buddhist thing.
In that case, welcome, Professor Emeritus from UT.
That is to the factually correct,
Yeah.
but it sounds awfully portentous. Yeah.
Well, you recently were in Pakistan and India.
I was in Pakistan last November. Oxford University Press has a very fine branch in Karachi, and they do a very good job producing textbooks and other kinds of books as well, poetry. And they have undertaken to do a number of my books as textbooks for universities. And they issued the first one, which is this one that I brought for you to.
Beckett's Land.
Yeah, Beckett's company.
Sorry.
And so I went there and I gave lectures at the universities of Punjab and Islamabad and Karachi, and in connection with that book, and the students are now, I suppose, buying that book and studying it.
When I first heard that you were involved in this, I was thrilled because I've been a fan of your writing for some time, and your work has been neglected, overlooked in post-colonial circles, and then in larger venues, because they don't know how to approach your work.
They do not have a preconceived pigeonhole in which to plonk me. One of the problems I have with these labels, post-cultural and post-colonial and multicultural, etc., is that they are there for the convenience of a few professors and for convenience of few students, but from the writer's point of view, they've got nothing to do with anything. My concern is with form, with style. My preoccupation is an aesthetic one. Obviously, there's a subject matter. Obviously, there's one's own life. One is not living in a vacuum. But there's a world around one. All kinds of awful things are going on all the time. Which is not to say that one should be sitting down and creating a documentation of one's time. But surely there is going to be some response or the other. But I'm not interested in the direct kind of a narration in which the story is told full of sociological matter. In fact, the kinds of novels that have socio-economical political matter, I detest those works because they simply serve a period, a time, and then they die. Not that I'm advocating that we should only write that which is not going to die, obviously it's beyond this. But surely, if you look back at history, so much has been written about people's time. It comes and goes, and every generation, every year almost, there is some great work which is supposed to be so important for our time, and then it dies, disappears. So, to go back to your question, why this neglect? Obviously because if you are going to have courses in post-colonialism, and I'm not talking about the train from Pakistan, and I'm not talking about the various problems that take place in 1947 and then since then, Kashmir, etc., etc., then people who are teaching me do not know what to do with the stuff. And also, I believe very strongly, whether I believe or not is irrelevant, but I'm largely influenced by what happened in the 20th century literature, especially in the first half of the 20th century. I'm very much influenced by people like Virginia Woolf and Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot and Samuel Beckett and James Joyce. And that phrase of Pound's from that time, make it new. And I was brought up to make it new. I grew up in my formative years as a writer. Soon after I got my degree, BA, from Keele University, I grew up in London, in the literary circles of London. And if you look at the history of the 1960s, you will find, look up the magazines, the Spectator, the New Statesman, TLS, etc. I will be there. And I was part of groups of poets, groups of young writers, and we met frequently, and we gave readings, and we talked, we exchanged work, and the emphasis always was make it new. We were excited when somebody came up with a new form or attempted to do so. Whereas since the 1980s, thereabouts perhaps, there has been a move towards more subject matter, less form. People are, I've heard the phrase used, oh, he lives in a vacuum, about my work. I don't live in a vacuum. I live within literature in a sense. I live in my mind, and I respond to the world around me. But it is, if people cannot understand the nature of the form, and if they cannot make a connection with what comes before me, then they should not be. Well, this is exactly what they're doing. They're not reading. They cannot.
Well, do you think that's partly what's at fault when it comes to the dearth of good book reviewing? I mean, a number of writers have complained recently about the lack of
well,
good
the
book
problem
reviewing.
with book reviewing is who is going to review your books? Who is knowledgeable enough? I'm going to give a talk later on, and I have a few things which I might repeat. One of the problems that writers have, especially writers like Faulkner and Nabokov and Beckett, is that they know so much more than most of us do. And we are simply not prepared intellectually to understand what they're doing. And how you get around that, I do not know. The writers often give the example of the sciences, that if you are a scientist, you don't go around writing papers in physics and astronomy that only Newton would understand. You have to take into consideration what has happened since then. Whereas in the writing of novels, people behave as though they're still in the 18th century. That is one of the problems. So my criticism, my complaint rather, is with you guys, with the teachers of literature, who are not giving enough emphasis or not giving direction in their teaching of literature as to what the form has been doing, what the style has been doing. Because the problem of the teacher, the professor, is what to say in the classroom. And I know myself that in my creative writing classes, we took a number of models, Virginia Woolf, Joyce, etc., and also some of the other straightforward standard writers, people like Flannery O'Connor. And in a discussion of those stories and poems and so on, we tended to talk about the subject matter. Sometimes I would tell amusing anecdotes from the lives of those people, because I happen to read biographies and know a lot of stuff. And somehow you have to pass 15 minutes or an hour and a quarter. And you go around in circles talking about various things. And those of us who like to appear to be really serious and intellectually advanced, we come up with the theoretical stuff. We come up with your Foucault and your Derrida and all of that stuff. And that impresses, that kind of discourse impresses certain types of students. So it passes time. Whereas the real stuff cannot be talked about. So there's a problem.
Cannot be talked about because the writer has written it.
It's there. There's a nice quotation in Flaubert. He says, if you go to an exhibition of paintings, those paintings which are the worst usually have the most written about them next to them, which is true. But nowadays we don't have paintings, we have installations which have a lot written about them next to them. But no, a work of art should stand by itself, really. But that makes your job redundant.
Well, I mean, part of what I try to do when I teach post-colonial novels is try to create a context for the writing.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that if a writer thinks that they have to supply both the history and the sociology and the psychology at the expense of story and form,
Yeah.
then they're not really focusing that strongly on being writers.
That's right, yeah.
As much. I figure that's my job.
Yeah.
That I have to do the work,
Yeah.
that I have to get my students to do
Yeah.
the work,
Yeah.
to create a kind of a framing for the text.
Yeah.
Well, way back in 1965, when you did your autobiography,
Yes.
at the age of 30,
Yes.
which is
It was written earlier. It was published when I was 30.
when you were 30, 65.
Yeah.
Confessions of a Native Alien. You talk about meeting a group of artists in Philly, and of whom you say, for them the problem of belonging to a country was specific and answerable in artistic terms. What were they to paint?
Hmm.
Peasants, bullock carts, lotus flowers, and so produce painting that would be recognized at once as Indian,
Hmm.
or paint what came from their experience,
Hmm.
and suffer the accusation of being called apes of the West simply because they ignored peasants, bullock carts, and
Hmm.
lotus flowers. And that leads me to two related questions. One is, do you feel that the Indian artist is still caught in the same trap? And then pertaining to your work in particular, I wonder if South America, there was your attempt to get out of that trap.
But to answer the last part, South America was not an answer to anything.
Huh.
It just happens that my wife was born there, and I go there, and so I have a lot of experience in South America. Also, I know many South American artists and writers, friends of mine, as opposed to Indians
Right.
or Pakistanis. So there's no mystery about South America in my work. It's just an accident of life. But the other part, I don't think I would make the kinds of pronouncements that I made when I was 28, 30 years old, because they sound terribly pretentious and very knowing. This young chap really is a great sophisticated person who has vast experience. He knows everything. Of course not. It's a suppose. But I do think that one of the problems the artist has, and I would say both the writer and other type of artists too. I mean, as you know, some composers or some musicians in India and Pakistan have had associations with Western composers and produced a hybrid version of music. They call it fusion music or something. And that seems to me to be a desperate kind of an attempt to make it into an international kind of a sound. And the result is yuckish, it's rarely any good. But with the writers writing in the English language and the painters putting works on canvas, and nowadays doing a lot of installations, the fact of the matter is that we are really carrying on what began in the West. That I maintain that you can be born in the Philippines or Singapore or anywhere else in the world where English is spoken, but if you're going to be writing in the English language, then you have to first of all steep yourself in the tradition of the English language, which is the language of Europe. So just because you might have a reference, when I wrote a poem the other day and I have a reference to the bulbul, a bird as you know from childhood, one tends to use some of those words, and there's a certain quaintness about that, because it's almost as though, look at me, I'm different from the West, I'm absorbing something from the East. And that becomes a mannerism, and I don't know whether that works or not. In painting especially, I have seen certain works of highly praised painters in Pakistan and in Bombay and in India. And these are people who are highly influenced by abstract expressionism. And that is fine, no problem with that. But the results were neither here nor there. It was just a fairly mediocre imitation of what one had experienced from the major abstract expressionists in Europe. that was my problem at 1965, and maybe it might still be. But it's a difficult thing. And also, things have changed since then. Now, because of globalization, what I maintain is that the world changed radically around 1970 when the jumbo jet took off. The jumbo jet changed the nature of the geography of the world and the travel. Before that, if you traveled, you were part of a very elitist kind of a group, because it costs money to do that. The first time I traveled to Brazil, '67, the fare was enormous. In today's terms, it'll be tens of thousands of dollars. And then the jumbo jet came on, and with that, the fares went down, and package deals began, and the people began to go all over the place. That is when the world changed. And now we take it for granted that we can be anywhere. And the way in which the transmission of ideas takes place, and the way in which you can't be a writer or an artist of any distinction nowadays in any place, immediately the rest of the world knows about you, which is very different from the past. So what one does, whether one is in India or Pakistan or wherever, has become irrelevant in a sense, except for the fact that I am always I, and obviously where I am born is going to have some influence on me naturally.
Well, certainly part of your experience is built upon where you find yourself.
Yeah.
And that'll affect your writing.
Oh, sure. And I said this to the students I met in Pakistan recently, that because I am I, each one of us, the fact that one is born within a certain group of people, I refer back to Jung's idea of the collective unconscious and the racial archetypes. And I say, people accuse me, especially in Pakistan, they say, oh, why don't you write about Pakistan, and why don't you have more, etc. They always want this image of themselves. People do that. And I said, listen, just look at the work a bit more closely than you do. I was born in Sialkot. I'm a Punjabi. And although I have never really lived there, except for my first 7 years, there are certain things that are part of my psyche that belong to that part. There are images there, which, and also, who is a Punjabi? A Punjabi is not somebody right now. You and I, Punjabis, behind us are Sikhs, Buddhists, Greeks, Muslim invasions, Hindus, a whole lot of matter there. And they have planted their imagery in our unconscious mind. It comes back. I remember some years ago, on a previous visit to Pakistan, I went to Taxila, which is an old Buddhist site. One of the oldest universities in the world was there. It's a Buddhist monastery there. And I had this strange epiphany, feeling as though I'd been here before. And I realized, of course, I had never been there before. But it's not a matter of reincarnation. Maybe there's something there, some recognition of the soul, we may use that word, that appreciates that something is there that is attracting me. And then I looked up the history of that place, and I found that because of the invasions that were taking place, that people from that area were driven away towards Kashmir. That's where my family comes from. So maybe there's something there. I don't know. Or it could be a complete fantasy, complete illusion. All I'm saying is that even when I'm writing about Brazil, I'm never writing about Brazil. My novels are sometimes set part of Brazil. There's an imagery there, and if you look closely at that imagery and dig away, and you will find it goes back to Punjab. So you cannot avoid being yourself.
Certainly in the trilogy set in Brazil, where you look at the last 4 centuries in Brazil, you find a lot of that movement of populations, the succession of peoples coming in that you just mentioned about with the Punjab area. One one after another, and then the intermingling, whether in actual terms or in psychic terms, certainly going on in that trilogy. In Don Bueno, no, let me come back to Don Bueno in a second. It's in A New History of Torments. You said that you got your title for it from a poem by Neruda. And then the two parts of the novel come from another Neruda poem. And then the epigraph for the first part is from T.S. Eliot.
T.S. Eliot, yes.
Now, obviously, poetry and fiction come together for you. Can you talk a little bit about how they do that, or is it fair to say that they come together, or is there some other kind of connection?
Yeah, if you look at my novels, especially New History of Torments, Don Bueno, and Figures of Enchantment, they're really poems. Well, I should not be saying this.
Well, here comes the pearl.
No, but they are images. They are what is the word here? I create a pattern. You see.
Well, you said you begin often with an image and not necessarily with an idea.
Well, I don't know how much time you got, but I can tell you a story here. How New History of Torments came about. It was the month of May, which is when the classes end. First week of May, the classes end, and after that, we have 3.5 months of freedom from university work. And I said to myself, okay, classes end on Friday, and on Sunday I'm going to sit down and start a new novel. And I'll finish it during the holidays. And then, of course, the dreadful question, what about? What is it going to contain? And I had no idea. I said, all right, what I will do is I will turn it around. Behind me is a bookshelf, contains some of the reference works. And I will pull out Bullfinch's anthology, and I'll open it at random. Whatever comes will be my story. And I did so, and it happened to be Jason and the Argonauts. So I said, okay. Now, I had recently been to Ecuador, and while I was in Ecuador, I was taken near Quito to a farm on which, on the house of the farm, on the terrace, somebody had drawn a line, and this is where the equator went through. This was the equator. And so, like usual, everybody who finds himself in that kind of situation becomes a complete idiot. So I put one foot this side, one foot this side, and walked on the two hemispheres. And I thought that was jolly nice. And that was it. And then I had previously been to the Amazon region, and I've taken a little boat and gone into the river. So there were these two experiences. I said, all right, there's Jason and the Argonauts, and you have these two images. So I will start with my Jason in this farm here, and I will involve him in all these adventures of the Argonauts and take him back into the Amazon. So in order to create that, I then began to look for other images, and there I was, month of May, cutting the grass in the front lawn, and across the road my neighbor arrives in his car, which happened to be a gold-colored Lincoln Continental. Lincoln Continental made by Ford Mercury, Mercury, your god of whatever. And so I said, I'll take this car and I'll have it crushed, and I will shape it into the Golden Fleece. And that's what happens in the novel. You see, what you do is you start with something or the other. It starts as a joke, really. But because you have to fill up one page after another to get to the end, you make it up as you go along. And the thing writes itself, in a sense. And so, in order to create all of that, that is the framework of the story. But that is just an artificial framework. The rest is the imagination. And it's a language, it is a sentences always. And it is the sentence of that moment that changes things. And that is where the imagistic pattern comes in. That is why I say these novels are really poems. In that sense. But that is just a phrase.
You know, reading some of your work reminded me a lot of Wilson Harris's work.
Yes.
And I was very pleased to hear you mention Jung, because that's almost one
Oh,
of the
yes.
first things I think of when I think of
He's very
Paris.
Jungian, yes. He and I are very great friends, by the way.
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
I find, I don't know if he's cautiously set himself in, or is writing in Guyana so that he can explore his Jungian interests more nakedly or not.
His experience, he's not gone back to Guyana for decades.
Mm.
But when he was a young man, he was a land surveyor there, so he went into the interior. But the imagery is there from his own memories, but he reads so much.
Yeah.
Much of our substance comes from reading.
Mm.
It's got nothing to do with anything else.
Mm.
Yeah, and he knows his Jung. He knows everybody.
Yeah. In your essay on Hamlet,
Yes.
Hamlet proof work and language, you point out that in Hamlet a key pair of words is speech and silence.
Yes.
I've noticed a pair of words come up a number of times in some of your works, and that's comprehension and confusion.
Mm.
I noticed it first in Confessions,
Yeah.
and then I noticed it again in Don Bueno, and I believe I saw it in Triple Mirror itself as well. Is that something that you find you try to play out, and you try to address in your work cautiously, or is that something that I happen to pick up?
Well, that is the perception of the critic, very fine. I never thought of it, but I'm very much concerned. I mean, you see, I read a lot of philosophy. I studied philosophy as an undergraduate, and I'm very much absorbed by the idea of perception and trying to understand the nature of reality, to take from the chaos those images that seem to make some kind of a sense. And so that comprehension is perhaps to do with the idea of reality.
Mm. And certainly, I imagine speech is an attempt at comprehension.
Yes, speech, everything is language and signs and symbols, whether it is the speech that I am with great difficulty trying to utter right now, or it is the carefully revised and polished speech that one tries to create in one's work, or whether it is simply the signs and symbols that one creates in other languages, language of physics, language of chemistry, and so on. I think it's all language. I think what reality is there is apprehendable only in terms of what we can convert, what signs and symbols we can convert it to, through which we try to understand it. So maybe it's speech.
One last question for you. You said that you read when you write.
That's right. That's all one does.
Who are you reading now?
Right now, in fact, yesterday I started to go back to Chaucer. Before that, it was Boccaccio. Before that, it was Proust. I just finished last month writing a book on Proust, which began by itself. I have been a fairly fanatical admirer of Proust for many years, and I've read him about 6 times now. And one day I suddenly found myself writing, creating an image that comes out of his obsession with certain objects. And that led to another sentence and another sentence. The next thing I know, I have a 200-page book. So I finished that the other day. And since then, I've been reading these. One of the great pleasures of life is rereading. And of course, discovering new things is always very exciting. But when I go back to people like Boccaccio and Chaucer, it is so thrilling. Why bother? Why are we doing anything after that? It's all been done.
Well, I for
unless
one,
you can make it new.
I'm glad that you bothered. and thank you very much for your time.
Okay, and I hope you will prove to your father that you can write a novel.
I'll work on that.